Profiles in Propaganda, Masters of Manipulation.
It's time for U.S. World Report. Here's Tom Osborne.
These are the stories making headlines this week. A gunman opened fire inside a bank in downtown Cincinnati on Thursday morning, killing at least 3 people and wounding others before being shot and killed by police. Officials say the shooter began firing inside a loading dock before he exchanged fire with law enforcement. United Nations mediated peace talks on Yemen appeared to be in jeopardy, with no sign in Geneva of the delegation from the Houthi movement on the first day. Martin Griffiths, the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, said in a statement that he had discussed confidence buildings with Yemen's Foreign Minister Khalid al-Yamani. For the crime of striking Unite the Right organizer Jason Kessler, a Charlottesville, Virginia jury says Jeffrey Winder must pay a fine of $1, far short of the maximum possible penalty. Winder had appealed his original guilty finding, which included a 30-day jail sentence. The Trump administration is proposing to lift court-imposed limits on how long it can hold children in immigration detention. The current Judiciary Committee hearings have become a showcase for America's divisions, featuring erupting protests on the nomination hearings seating Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. The arguments on both sides have split the country once again. The opposition are hoping to raise enough negative consciousness about Kavanaugh in order to force Trump to compromise as weeks and days move closer to an election that may affect control of the bully pulpit. Which brings us to our story of the week: Profiles in Propaganda, Masters of Manipulation. And here's Dr. David Canervo, a resident historian and political scientist, to give us the backstory. David?
Thank you, Tom. Propaganda is using information, true or not, to further one's goals. Often we think of propaganda as the control of information by government to promote itself and its policies. We usually picture propaganda as the instrument of totalitarian governments for the purpose of controlling its citizens. During World War II, Joseph Goebbels was the minister of propaganda for Nazi Germany. He is quoted as saying that we should, quote, think of the press as a great keyboard on which the government can play, unquote. He also stated that it is, quote, the absolute right of the state to supervise the formulation of public opinion, unquote. Fortunately for us, the framers of the Constitution were wary of governmental power and inserted checks and balances into our system so that no one small group of people could exercise too much power. In addition, they quickly added the Bill of Rights during the first Congress to further limit the encroachment of the federal government on individual freedom. The First Amendment specifically sets out to guarantee a free press that is not controlled or manipulated by government. While government officials certainly have the right to give us their side of every story, the press has the right to provide alternative explanations and analyses of the day's events so that citizens can decide for themselves what to believe. Ken?
Thank you, David. You made a quote from Joseph Goebbels, so I thought maybe we'd start and play that propaganda film dating back to World War II, and here it is.
February the 10th, 1933. The Fuhrer gave a fantastic speech with a very sharply worded challenge to the communists. At the end, he drifted into wonderful, truly incredible pathos, concluding his oration with the word, Amen. It seemed so natural that everyone was captivated and deeply moved. It was filled with such power and faith, was so novel and courageous, and had such power and stature that nothing from the past bears comparison with it. February the 20th, 1933. I saw the film of the Fuhrer's speech at the Sports Palace. The footage worked very well. It will prove indispensable to us as a propaganda tool. This film will be shown wherever the Fuhrer cannot make speeches. Its power comes above all from the coherence and harmony of word, facial expression, and gesture. Now meetings are becoming a real pleasure. We have a new subject that grips us all. We have enthusiasm, energy, and absolute commitment for our cause. We have audiences that respond passionately. We can speak from the heart, and we no longer need to spare our enemies' feelings. For the election, we're generating large amounts of money, and this will put an end to all our financial problems. I set the propaganda machinery in motion, and an hour later the printing presses were chattering away. February the 21st, 1933. Our propaganda is considered to be exemplary, not just by the German press, but by the international press too. We have acquired so much expertise in this field during previous election campaigns that we can overcome our opponents. We frighten them, and they hardly dare utter a word. Now we will show what the apparatus can achieve if you know how to use it.
Dr. Canervo, another very famous American general, made a statement right after the war. Can you quote that for us?
Well, I think it was his farewell address, former President Eisenhower said that we need to beware of the military-industrial complex. And with that statement, I think what he was saying is that we need to be careful that that particular interest group, as he saw it, doesn't become too powerful and guide our policy unnecessarily. Ken?
Tom, would you like to add anything to that?
Thanks, Ken. I was quite moved, of course, sending chills down my spine as you listened to that roll-in. And of course, I had a great deal of luck in my research this week, having stumbled on an excellent article in Psychology Today by Dr. Noam Spencer. But before we dive into Spencer, I think it is a given by many that the propagandist process subordinates the facts to an agenda, even at the price of distorting or ignoring the facts altogether. And let's keep in mind there's good propaganda and there's bad propaganda. Spencer starts out with the reminder of the old saying, if you can't find the sucker at the poker table, you're it. In the present moment in our history, it might be said, if you don't hear much about propaganda, that's what you're hearing. Spencer writes, the term propaganda had its origins in the 17th century by efforts of the Catholic Church to propagate its views and to stem the rise of Protestantism. It's gone through various permutations since. By the time Hitler was dead and the Cold War underway, the word had lost its godly associations and became a pejorative, connoting mostly the self-serving lies of various tyrannical regimes. Yet propaganda, properly understood, is non-discriminating, inclusive with regard to its users, contents, and ends. Propaganda, in other words, the word itself doesn't imply truth or falsehood or pass judgment on the agenda. It's understood as such that the propaganda is not the sole providence of one side or the other in the political or any other arena. It's a tool that may be used by both sides. Indeed, assigning the propaganda label to the opposite camp in a conflict is itself a common propaganda move. Moreover, propaganda may be used to achieve good ends, as I suggested. This does not make it any less problematic, just as assassinating Hitler would not have made assassination as an approach to solving ideological disagreements any less problematic. Propaganda traffics mostly in emotions and not just negative ones. Propagandists appeal to our fears, but also to our courage, our hatred, and our friendship and our love. We saw dramatic evidence of this recently in the passing of Senator John McCain, as the nation took 5 days of public mourning to say goodbye over the television networks. Where did this come from? It was an outpouring, no doubt, that the senator, a Vietnam POW for 5 years, having survived that, served his country another 30 years until his death. This kind of outpouring of national emotion and trauma, rare, is certainly indicative of much more than our devotion to Senator McCain's service. It's also a profound statement about the standards our country holds in allowing our representatives to represent us, the deeper part of our relationship to the truth. What we believe and what we hear are not always the truth. Ken?
Well, Tom, a follow-up question real quick. Has propaganda changed much since World War II?
Yes, I think it has changed. It's morphed into something that almost, everyone, in fact, is in the process of trying to figure out how to control it, and that is the social media. every single level of our society is permeated like a Swiss cheese with this new communication scene. And so it's all the more dangerous that we become educated, well-read, and quick to make decisions, but not decisions that will be uninformed and out of fear. Ken?
Well, it's very obvious propaganda is part of war, both in the past and in the current times. And here's an example. In 2013, Iran showed pictures of their new stealth fighter jet flying over northern Iran, and it was soon discovered that it was photoshopped. And during the McCarthy era, mass media tried to convince everyone that communists were taking over the United States. And Alexander the Great intimidated an army by leaving armor and helmets that were very large when they retreated. And this made them look like giants. Mary?
You're listening to U.S. World Report with Tom Osborne, Dr. David Canervo, Ken McCaleb, and Mary Saliba. And we'll be back right after these messages, so stay with us. Welcome back to U.S. World Report with Ken McCaleb, Dr. David Canervo, Tom Osborne, and Mary Saliba. Ken?
Thank you, Mary. This next clip is from a podcast titled I Greer 23, and it asks the question, what is propaganda?
Testimonials may be the one propaganda technique that you are most familiar with. Testimonials can be characterized by their use of endorsements. But what is an endorsement exactly? By definition, an endorsement is a formal approval or sanction. So in the world of advertising, a famous athlete, actor, or other public figure gives their stamp of approval on a product, service, or company. And it basically works like this. Famous person X says product Y is good. You like famous person X, so you'll try the product. The idea is to play off of your respect or admiration for the celebrity and transfer it to what is being sold to you. Framing is probably the most deceptive propaganda technique you are likely to come across. The chief characteristic of this technique is its use of bias. Bias is defined as a particular tendency or inclination, especially one that prevents fair consideration of the idea or topic being presented. Put simply, if you are using bias, you are picking and choosing the facts that support your argument and ignoring those that do not. Bias and framing work hand in hand because with framing, you are only getting one side of the story. Basically, framing could be identified less by what you are told and more by what you are not. Bandwagon is a very powerful propaganda technique. Bandwagon itself is defined as a party, cause, or movement which by its mass appeal or strength readily attracts many followers. This technique is unique because it does not have any specific characteristic, but instead can be identified because of the way that it plays off of our natural want or need to be part of the crowd or to be accepted by those around us. Bandwagon leads us to ask questions like, if everyone else is doing it, why shouldn't we? Working through propaganda is sometimes easier said than done. It forces us to stop and ask questions of ourselves rather than to go ahead and do what we see as right, cool, or maybe even expected. Here are some questions to ask yourself when being faced with testimonial propaganda. How do I really feel about the product itself? Is the product really as good as the endorser says it is? You might need to do a little research or even ask around to friends and family. Remember, the endorser is being paid to say that the product is good. When being faced with framing, ask yourself, what do I know about this product or topic? Do you know any information that the advertiser is leaving out, possibly intentionally? Even if you don't know everything about what is being discussed, sometimes knowing that they are lying about even part of the story is helpful. How is the information being presented? This is especially helpful with statistics. To avoid bandwagon propaganda, ask yourself things like this. Is what is popular really that good? Focus more on the product and less on the crowd. It might seem unnatural, but sometimes you don't want to do what everyone else does. If a product is a waste of money, then it is a waste of money, regardless of how many people around you like it. Do you really need the product? Sometimes the sense of urgency that bandwagon produces makes you feel like you need something that you really don't. Before buying into the ad, stop and think about how much use you will really get out of the product. You might change your mind.
David, this topic is more complicated than following your favorite sports hero and the brand of sneakers they might wear. I mean, I hear kids are buying sneakers for $800 or more. Your opinion?
Well, you're certainly right that it is more than just simply buying sneakers. These three facets of propaganda that the gentleman talked about in the roll-in are all used both in advertising and by advertising, I mean commercial advertising, but also in politics as well. If you think about the political ads that we see on TV, the use of a testimonial where you have an endorsement by one candidate of another, one office holder of another. These are people who supposedly have a very popular following, and as a result are supposed to bring those followers with them. If you look at this idea of framing, it is very much showing certain facts and hiding others. It's like taking a picture, a snapshot, and showing only part of it rather than the whole snapshot itself, as you would in a large frame. You're getting part of the facts, and I would argue that in some cases you're not getting any of the facts. Certainly some of the commercials I've seen recently have shown no truth at all in the testimony that they're providing. And in the bandwagon effect, we talk about this certainly in polling, that if we see a poll where someone is leading someone else, that this is supposed to get people to join on or jump on the bandwagon, to also like the same person as well, that if all these other people do, then certainly we must like them as well. Now, there's a certain amount of truth to these things, but there's not a great deal of truth to all of them. For example, the bandwagon effect. We know that it might occur in some cases in polling, but while we know that there's some in polling, some tendency to want to jump on the bandwagon, we also know that there are people who like the underdog and want to go for that person because they feel sorry for him or her being behind. So my point is that these are all aspects of propaganda that are commonly used. They can be important, but at the same time, we are all individuals. Many of us think for ourselves, and they are likely to have only limited effect in what they do to changing and influencing our public opinions. Ken?
Tom Osborne, would you care to weigh in on this?
Well, thanks, Ken. You know, I follow David. When someone talks to us about democracy, we immediately think of our own definite ideas about democracy, the ideas we learned at home and at school, and often where we worship. Our first and natural reaction is to assume that the speaker is using the word that he believes as we do on this important subject. This lowers our sales resistance and makes us far less suspicious than we ought to be when the speaker begins telling us things like the United States must do what they must do to preserve their democracy. Another manifestation of propaganda, as mentioned, is transfer. The propagandist seeks to transfer onto himself or his cause the esteem and respect we have for someone else. Celebrity endorsements. Both Ken and I have seen this over the years in the United Nations, where many celebrities are invited to be UN ambassadors for a particular cause. The goodwill ambassadors thereby transfer their authority, sanction, and prestige to that program. UNICEF is often using this approach to bring the world's notice to the urgent needs of help following war and tragedies of nature, and, of course, what they are seeing. Thus, we may accept something which otherwise we might reject. And plain folks is another approach which takes advantage of the human ability and desire to identify with like others. Card stacking is another. We call it hyping, a full-court PR press employing arts, the stack of cards against the truth, uses underemphasis and overemphasis to dodge issues, evades facts, resorts to lies, censorship, distortion, omits facts, offers false testimony, creates a smokescreen of clamor by raising a new issue when he wants embarrassment to be forgotten. These are the signs of propaganda that we should all be aware of. Ken?
Well, common examples of propaganda: building a mental image. A politician will say something like, crime is on the rise, and they'll overstate participation. Get on my bandwagon. And the third is building false images, as you mentioned, Tom. Presidents appearing as common folks eating at McDonald's. You're listening to U.S. World Report. We're up against a hard break, but we'll be back right after these messages. So stay with us.
Welcome back to U.S. World Report. I'm David Canervo, along with Tom Osborne, Ken McCaleb, and Mary Saliba, and we're talking about profiles in propaganda, masters of manipulation. Ken?
Thank you, David. Here's an audio clip from the Fox News Network.
Time now for news abuse, where we expose the most abominable cases of malpractice in the American press. We're joined by our old friend and an expert on this subject, Howard Kurtz. He's, of course, the host of Sunday morning's Media Buzz program, which we never miss. Howie, great to see you.
Great to be here.
So you've got,
Good.
What'd you get?
Okay, Kellyanne Conway, Donald Trump's White House counselor, probably his chief defender on TV, drawing a lot of very personal flack for her role. New York Times columnist Frank Bruni writes of the dark magic of this right-wing operative. And Carl Bernstein, the former Watergate sleuth, had this to say on CNN.
One of the great anonymous sources of our era is Kellyanne Conway. She does it every day. She has been an anonymous source for the last 10 months, particularly during this campaign when it suits her. And it's time to talk about what we do as journalists and what propaganda ministers do.
And Bernstein says she is a propaganda minister.
I love the fact that Carl Bernstein is decrying anonymous sources. The man who wrote the Watergate series is saying, you know what, I just don't like when people speak on background. It just makes me uncomfortable. They meet me in parking garages at night and tell me stuff. I'm against that.
Yeah, I've totally made my whole career.
Unbelievable.
But also, every operative aide, advisor from every campaign, Democrat, Republican, they all speak to reporters off the record, and they spin and they deflect and they defend. That's what they do. So why single out Kellyanne Conway as a propaganda minister, unless maybe you don't like her and she's a former Republican?
Well, sure, and plus, that they're all paid liars, but I think she's much more charming than most, my view.
Tom Osborne, the newscasters in that clip are laughing it up a bit. Your thoughts on Kellyanne Conway?
Well, I think she's carved out a place for herself in history. I don't know whether she'll appreciate what that place is in future years to come. I guess we'll see how all things turn out. But certainly she is articulate, and don't forget, she's the person who gave us the word alternative thoughts. And that's something that puzzles a lot of Americans, because what we think that is American is mainstream conversation, and there's always different ideas, but what about an alternative thinking, a group that's separated, that's in power, that has some influence in the country? It sounds a lot like Russian propaganda sometimes, and we fall prey to it. Michael Hayden, in his book, The Assault on Intelligence, American National Security in the Age of Lies, was former director of the CIA, you'll recall. But he asks how the Russians got to where they got. Well, propaganda, according to Hayden, 2 or 3 steps, one of which was his. So he talks about his re-education, so focused on counterterrorism that he missed Russia in all the countries that he visited, and he calls it my bad. But again, it's not ignoring them. You're just consumed over here. And the fact is that General Gerasimov is now chief of the general staff of Vladimir Putin, and he was the one who developed a new concept of warfare that he had explored, and we are pushing back on that now, and it's called cyber. They did it to their domestic audience. They did it to us, the Europeans, with the information bubble over Crimea. We're all wondering what's going on. And then they took their game to North America in 2015, an exercise in Texas where Russian bots and alt-right media convinced many Texans that Obama planned to round up political dissidents. And it got so much traction, the governor of Texas had to call out the National Guard to observe the federal exercises to keep the population calm. At that point, the Russians were saying, we can do this big time. And at that point, they made the decision, and we're going to play in the electoral process, they said, according to Hayden. Hayden concludes, you can throw it out to naivete or inexperience. They were surrounded by anyone who had the antenna to say, whoa, there's something wrong here. There is something called convergence, where you may not be actually going this way, but you each, for your own purposes, are doing something, and your activities are mutually reinforcing. The perfect example of propaganda gone by. The president gives a speech about NFL players taking a knee to protest the killing of young Americans in our inner cities, even our small towns, as Hayden describes it. Before he gets back to Washington, Russian bots are all over it. Taking a knee, they inject a powerful racial content into it, and then it gets to the major networks, beginning with those most favorable to an administration. Then we have cycles, everyone for their own interests, allowing the Russians to mess with our heads, all driving in the same direction, and the sum total is a more divided American society. Ken?
Dr. Canervo, is it fair to label Kellyanne Conway as a propaganda minister?
In some ways it is. Certainly she is out in front talking to the press, defending the president, and trying to explain why he does what he does, and of course defend his actions. At the same time, though, we find that that's true for every president. There's always someone out there, either in front openly, using their name, or behind the scenes, speaking off the record, who is releasing information, trying to put the best face forward for the president.
You're listening to U.S. World Report, and we'll be back right after this.
Welcome back to U.S. World Report. I'm Tom Osborne, and today we're talking about profiles in propaganda, masters of manipulation. Ken?
Thank you, Tom. This next audio clip is from Amy Goodman and Noam Chomsky, who is very popular among today's college students. I would take this as a different form of spin from the Al Jazeera network.
Propaganda. Many use the word when talking about countries like North Korea, Kazakhstan, Iran. Countries viewed as authoritarian through the lens of the Western media. Press freedom, freedom of thought. People use those terms when talking about countries like the United States, France, Australia, democracies. In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their endgame, profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources stray away from the consensus, they get flagged. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
Tom, you've been writing for the U.S. World Report's program blog about today's topic. Would you be willing to share with us what you've been writing?
Absolutely, Ken. Thank you. We live in extraordinary times when a majority of Americans believe the president is on the wrong course, about 60%. Propaganda runs wild. In such times, we rightly ask, who are we to trust? Who's in charge? I remember that ghastly moment when, after the firings in the Nixon administration led to a constitutional crisis, and the Reagan shooting where General Haig, then the president's chief of staff, went on camera at the White House and told us not to worry. He was in charge. Of course, that was the worst possible handling of a growing crisis. If at any time we find we have a commander-in-chief that is unfit for office, though never administered, it is called the 25th Amendment, under which and supported by the Cabinet and the Congress, a president can be removed from office for being unfit, one way or another, to serve. Quoting former CIA Director John Brennan, we are living in a moment when consciousness might take precedent over the office taken by government officials. Brennan reminds us that it is against the law to follow an order you believe to be illegal. This applies to any and all who serve in our government and our Congress, a position held by administrations throughout American history. This includes an order that is given which may have had disastrous consequences for our nation and our world, and I would add, our place in it. This moment requires individuals of conscience to be able to push back against abnormal thinking and try to resist it. Secretary Mattis has been doing exactly that, including, it is reported recently, giving a counter order to attack North Korea. Ken?
David, now, what would you say might be the Republicans' point of view from this clip that we've heard of Al Jazeera? You know, as you recall, Al Jazeera is not really heard throughout the United States at all.
Well, Ken, I think that the Republican perspective might very well be one in which there are different voices out there. The Democrats and those who dislike Trump are taking one position, but Trump has his right to present his own point of view, and Republicans can support him as they see fit. So that it's a matter of different points of view being offered to the people of this country. One side won the election, the presidential election, one side did not. And part of being in a democracy is that there's going to be this back and forth between the two sides, in which the party out of power criticizes the party in power, and it's very natural for the party in power to, of course, defend what they're doing and what they say they were elected to do. Ken?
Tom Osborne, is it possible for a journalist to be totally objective? I mean, if you look at CNN versus Fox, NBC versus CBS, how would you evaluate their ability to spin the story?
Well, I can't really evaluate them so much as much my own experience with ABC, and I recall that you could never have that sort of experience with Peter Jennings, who was one of the most outstanding journalists. But I think, generally speaking, we have younger journalists coming along the way, and those old rules, they just kind of have to be dusted off and put back on the table. And I think that's really the position we're in. And we are going to go back to some values that we've lost along the way, particularly in journalism, as we stand up for what we're writing in a very difficult time. Ken?
You're listening to U.S. World Report, and we're We're going to take a break, but when we come back, Mary Saliba, our staff editorialist, will wrap things up. So stay with us. Welcome back to U.S. World Report, and this is our show summary segment where we get a chance to hear from our news team editorialist, Mary Saliba. Mary?
Thanks, Ken. That non-rational propaganda is winning a war against reason in the 21st century is less surprising than that anybody ever thought reason was a fighting force. But we do. I do. I think a reasonable person has to believe this or lose hope. Propaganda that goes against our own self-interest has worked consistently en masse by rousing our survival instincts, using repetition, distraction, fear, blame. Go at people's guts, not their brains. It worked in Germany, works in Russia and China, with Brexit and Trump. You can see the repetition strategy at rallies where people chant "lock her up," even though it's no longer relevant. USA, a chant that was also effective after 9/11. Or when people chant fake news, rejecting one of their most powerful tools against manipulation, the reporting of facts by a free and legitimate press. Look how easily Trump himself is subject to it. When he returned from meeting with Kim Jong-un, he announced that the U.S. military exercises in the region were provocative, a phrase right out of the North Korean propaganda book. It's ironic that the stage for winning the minds of the people through their most basic gut instincts is built with the highest level of technology. The internet and mass manipulators were made for each other. False information can get to us 24/7 with social networks giving us a constant feed of our own beliefs. News sources that may be only one person quoting made-up stories with 100,000 bots agreeing. Artificial intelligence has been weaponized, sowing dissent, weighing in on our own issues like gun control and immigration. We read headlines disseminated by bots and spread it to our own human friends. I wish the rallying cries of goodness and reason were as hugely successful as those that appeal to our fears and protectionism. They aren't, and we are being used as information weapons against ourselves and our own self-interest, and it's up to us to stop it, to get into the business of monitoring our own consumption, especially before we hit share. This has been Mary Saliba for U.S. World Report. Ken?
Thanks, Mary. Dr. Canervo, any final thoughts for today's show?
Well, it seems to me that in a world in which propaganda is so widespread and there are different sides of the truth, so to speak, it's important that we have a free press, one in which they can look at different sides, talk about what they see as the facts, and present a multitude of voices for the citizens to consider for themselves and decide where the truth may lie. Ken?
You know, Tom Osborne, we didn't even get to talk about books on propaganda like Animal Farm and others. Can you think of any?
Well, there's Johnny Got His Gun. Do you remember that one? It was back in the 60s, but it was about a man who came back from the war with no arms and legs, and his whole story was told from his hospital bed. Quite an astonishing book, Johnny Got His Gun. And we thank you, Ken and David, and I would close with the words of Professor Elie Wiesel. Even our darkness, it is possible to create light and encourage compassion. With that, we're out of time. We value your thoughts and opinions and welcome your visit to our website, usworldreport.org, and please email your thoughts at usworldreport@gmail.com. For Mary Saliba, our editorialist, Ken McCaleb, our moderator, Dr. David Canervo, our resident historian and political scientist, and myself, Tom Osborne. Thanks for listening.